It was a bright and bustling afternoon in the heart of the city. People moved in all directions, walking past the historic landmarks and admiring the beauty around them. Among the crowd stood a royal guard, dressed in his pristine uniform. His posture was upright, his eyes sharp and focused. This was a man of discipline and honor, someone who had dedicated his life to his duties. He had seen everything from curious tourists to unruly crowds, but today would be different. Little did he know, this afternoon would bring something unexpected. The royal guard was stationed near one of the most famous attractions, his job to maintain order and keep watch over the monument. His eyes scanned the surroundings, taking in the sights, but always staying alert. Though he didn't say much, his calm and steady presence told everyone that he was a person of great self-control. Most tourists would approach with a smile, take pictures, and sometimes ask for directions, but they all respected his silence, knowing that his role was one of responsibility. But on this particular day, things were different. A man, dressed in disheveled clothing, appeared on the street corner. He was walking aimlessly, muttering under his breath. It didn't take long for him to spot the royal guard standing there, motionless like a statue. For reasons unclear, a sense of irritation seemed to build within him. He started walking closer, his steps more deliberate, his gaze fixed on the guard. As he passed by, he shot a few rude comments in the guard's direction. At first, the guard didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't even look the man's way. That was part of his training, to ignore provocations and stay focused on his job. He had seen all kinds of distractions before and had learned to remain calm under any circumstances. But the man wasn't going to let it go so easily. He stopped, turned around, and began shouting louder. "Hey, what are you looking at, huh?" The man's voice was slurred, clearly irritated, but there was something more in his tone. It wasn't just frustration. It was a deep-seated anger that seemed to burn inside of him. The man pointed at the guard, insulting him further. "You think you're better than me." The guard, still unmoved, stood silent. He had no intention of engaging, but the man's voice grew louder, drawing more attention. A few people nearby looked over, unsure of what was happening. Some were nervous, unsure if the situation was escalating into something more dangerous. But the guard, without a word, remained perfectly still, as though the words didn't even reach him. Then, in a move that caught everyone by surprise, the man did something that no one could have predicted. With a sudden shout, he commanded his dog, an aggressive-looking animal, to attack. The dog, a large breed, immediately began barking, its teeth showing as it rushed toward the guard, following its owner's command. The crowd gasped, unsure of what would happen next. The royal guard still did not move. He had faced challenges before, but this moment would be different. It wasn't just about his training now. It was about how he would respond to a provocation that threatened to disrupt everything. Would he defend himself? Would he retaliate against the man and the dog? Or would he rise above it all and handle the situation with composure? As the dog got closer, the guard's eyes narrowed, and his body tensed ever so slightly. Something told him that today was not a day for violence. It was a day for strength. Strength not just of the body, but of character. He knew that how he handled this moment would not only affect him, but everyone who had witnessed it. The man's command echoed through the air, sharp and demanding. His voice was filled with frustration and a sense of superiority, as if he thought the guard would be intimidated by his actions. The dog, an imposing creature with a muscular build, growled menacingly as it charged forward, its teeth bared and eyes focused on the royal guard. The crowd, which had been casually watching the scene unfold, suddenly tensed, unsure of what would happen next. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to unease as people began to pull out their phones, capturing the unexpected drama. The royal guard, however, remained perfectly still. He didn't flinch, didn't show fear. His face was an unreadable mask, his body held in perfect discipline. The dog's growls grew louder as it closed the distance between itself and the guard, who still did not move a muscle. The man, who was shouting at the guard moments before, now laughed with a cruel sense of satisfaction, thinking the guard would have no choice but to react. "What are you going to do now?" he taunted, a sneer on his face. The dog was only a few feet away now, its speed incredible, its body poised to lunge. The crowd was on edge, some whispering nervously to each other, others backing away slowly. It seemed like a moment of inevitable confrontation. No one believed the guard could stay unmoved when faced with such aggression. The man continued to yell, egging the dog on, believing he had the upper hand. His dog was big, strong, and had the power to cause damage. In his mind, it was a win-win situation. But what happened next was not what anyone expected. The royal guard, despite the dog's aggressive posture and the man's insults, did not respond with aggression or fear. Instead, he took a step forward, slowly, carefully, and placed his hand gently on the dog's collar, guiding it to a halt. The animal, startled by the firm yet calm grip, stopped immediately, its growls dying down. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. The guard's actions were precise, controlled, and executed with an effortless grace that seemed almost unreal. The man, now flustered, shouted at the guard once more. "What do you think you're doing?" he yelled, his face reddened with anger. But the guard did not reply. His eyes remained fixed on the dog, his grip firm but gentle, as if he understood the animal's instincts. The dog, now subdued, stopped struggling and looked up at the guard, its growls replaced by a confused whine. The tension in the air was palpable, and the once aggressive animal was now under control. The guard hadn't heard it, hadn't even raised his voice. He simply calmed the situation, showing mastery of the situation without a single harsh movement. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The man was left speechless, standing there, dumbfounded. He had expected a violent confrontation, something that would give him the satisfaction of proving his point. But instead, the guard had turned the situation around completely. The crowd, which had been bracing for an outburst of violence, now stood in awe, whispering among themselves about the calm and quiet power the guard had displayed. The royal guard didn't need to prove anything. His actions spoke for themselves. In that moment, he had shown everyone something far more powerful than brute force. He had shown control, discipline, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from understanding one's own power. The dog, now calm, sat by his side, its earlier aggression forgotten, while the man stood there, staring at the guard in disbelief. The guard's unwavering calm had completely diffused the situation, leaving everyone around him in stunned silence. As the tension in the air started to dissipate, the crowd remained frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The dog, now calm and obedient, sat quietly by the guard's side, its earlier aggression completely vanquished by the guard's firm but gentle control. The man, still trying to make sense of what had just happened, stood there with his mouth slightly open, his face turning from red with anger to pale with confusion. The royal guard, however, showed no sign of triumph or satisfaction. He wasn't looking for applause, nor was he interested in confronting the man further. His role was clear: to protect, to serve, and to maintain composure no matter what. He had always lived by these principles, honed through years of training and experience. In times of stress or provocation, his instinct was not to fight, but to remain calm and assert control over the situation. For the guard, this moment was not about physical strength. It wasn't about showing off his ability to overpower the man or his dog. It was about something much deeper. His true strength lay in his ability to stay composed in the face of provocation. He had been trained to stay unshaken, to not allow external pressures to influence his actions. In a world where emotions often lead to hasty decisions, the royal guard had learned the power of pause, of taking a moment to breathe and assess before reacting. As the crowd watched in silence, the royal guard stood tall and silent, his eyes scanning the area once more. He didn't look at the man who had just attempted to provoke him. His focus was on the crowd, his presence a reminder that peace and respect always outweighed anger. He could feel the eyes of the people on him, some admiring his control, while others seemed uncertain, as though they were trying to figure out what had just happened. For a brief moment, the man, realizing that his attempts to rile the guard had failed, seemed to shrink back. His anger, which had been bubbling so strongly moments ago, began to fade into something like frustration and defeat. His initial pride in commanding his dog to attack seemed misplaced now. The guard's calmness had completely disrupted his sense of control. He had expected a fight, a reaction that he could justify, but instead he was left with an uncomfortable silence. The guard's steady presence had a strange power to it. While others might have felt the urge to escalate the situation further, the guard knew that showing restraint was often the most powerful response. He knew that in the face of hatred or aggression, responding with calmness and understanding could turn a situation around without ever needing to raise a hand in violence. His eyes remained steady, his posture unwavering, and his thoughts focused on his duty, keeping the peace and preventing further harm. The crowd, watching this quiet confrontation unfold, began to understand something profound. It wasn't just about the royal guard's ability to control a dog or stay calm in a tense moment. It was about the message his actions sent. In a world where anger and conflict often seemed to dominate, the guard's unshakable calm was a beacon of hope, a reminder that peace could be maintained without resorting to aggression. As the man's words trailed off, the royal guard's silence spoke volumes. It wasn't necessary for him to say anything. His actions had already made it clear that respect and restraint were the true marks of strength. The crowd began to shift, some stepping closer to the guard, while others quietly retreated from the scene. But no one could deny the impact of what they had just witnessed. A moment of control, a moment of peace, in the midst of a world often filled with conflict. As the man stood there, still staring at the royal guard, the tension in the air seemed to reach its peak. The crowd had become completely silent, their eyes fixed on the scene in front of them. Many of them were waiting for the next move, unsure of what would happen next. The dog, which had been on the verge of attacking only moments before, now sat quietly beside the guard, its head lowered, its earlier aggression forgotten. The man, still processing what had just happened, was at a loss for words. His entire plan had backfired. What had started as an act of intimidation was now quickly losing its power. The guard, calm and composed, stood there like a rock, completely unaffected by the chaos around him. He didn't speak a word, but his presence was enough to command the situation. His steady hands, which had once been holding the dog's collar, slowly released it. The dog, sensing that its owner's command no longer held sway, remained still. The guard took a few steps back, his posture still perfect, but his movements measured and deliberate. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. He had no need to prove anything. The man, now completely thrown off by the guard's unexpected reaction, tried to regain some of his lost confidence. He muttered a few more words, but they lacked the force they had earlier. The guard, however, still said nothing. His face remained calm, his eyes scanning the area with the same level of focus he had shown from the very beginning. He hadn't even raised a hand to defend himself, yet he had managed to control the situation with a quiet strength that the man and the crowd could not ignore. The onlookers were still watching in awe, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The man had expected violence, something loud and chaotic that would give him a sense of victory. But instead, the guard had turned the tables with the simplest of actions, remaining calm, asserting control without ever striking a blow. It was a lesson in restraint, in understanding that sometimes the most powerful response is not the one that involves physical force. The royal guard's ability to remain composed, even in the face of such provocation, was a testament to his training and inner strength. He had been taught to control his emotions, to stay centered no matter what happened around him. And in that moment, it was clear that his training had paid off. He had not only neutralized the threat posed by the dog, but he had also diffused the situation with a quiet authority that made any further confrontation seem unnecessary. As the guard stood there, his hands at his sides, the dog now calm and no longer a threat, the crowd began to stir. People who had been watching from the sidelines were now speaking in hushed tones, expressing their surprise and admiration for the guard's actions. Some were even taking a step closer, clearly wanting to acknowledge the courage they had just witnessed. The man, on the other hand, was left standing in silence, his earlier anger now replaced with confusion. He had no idea how to respond to the guard's calmness. The situation had slipped completely out of his control. The guard's presence, his ability to remain steadfast and unshaken, had made all the difference. He had shown that true strength wasn't about how loud you could shout or how fierce you could be. It was about how well you could keep your composure, how effectively you could handle a situation with wisdom and restraint. And in this moment, the Royal Guard had done just that, showing everyone watching that sometimes the greatest power lies in staying calm and letting your actions speak louder than any words could. The silence that followed the Royal Guard's composed handling of the situation felt almost unreal. The crowd, which had been bracing itself for a violent altercation, now stood in stunned quiet. It was as if time had slowed down, and everyone was waiting for something, anything, to happen next. The dog, now completely calm and subdued, sat obediently beside the guard, its earlier aggression now a distant memory. The tension that had once been so thick in the air seemed to dissipate with every passing second. The man, on the other hand, was anything but calm. He stood there, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief, his mouth slightly open as if he was still trying to make sense of what had just occurred. His plan had failed. He had expected the guard to react in anger, to fight back, to somehow give him the justification he was looking for. But instead, the guard had remained calm, unaffected by the insults and the threat of his dog. The man's eyes darted between the dog and the guard, his brain racing to figure out how to regain control of the situation. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen, as if waiting for the guard to do something. But the Royal Guard didn't move. His posture was as steady as ever, his eyes unflinching. The man, now realizing that his intimidation tactics had failed, let out a frustrated sigh. His earlier bravado had melted away, replaced by a sense of embarrassment and frustration. He had expected a confrontation, an explosive moment where he could prove his superiority. Instead, he had been met with a quiet strength that had completely thrown him off balance. "Why aren't you saying anything?" The man blurted out, his voice tinged with irritation. It was as if he couldn't comprehend the guard's silence. He wanted to provoke a reaction, to make the guard fight back in some way. But the guard's lack of response was unsettling to him. "What, are you too scared to do anything?" he continued, his words growing more desperate. But still, the Royal Guard remained silent. He didn't need to respond. His silence spoke volumes, louder than any words could. The guard wasn't afraid of the man, nor was he interested in engaging in a verbal sparring match. His focus was on his duty, on maintaining the peace and showing that strength didn't always have to be loud or aggressive. The man, now growing more agitated, clenched his fists, his anger bubbling up once again. He had no idea how to handle the situation. For a moment, he had thought he could intimidate the guard, that his insults and the threat of his dog would be enough to make the Royal Guard falter. But instead, he had been met with an unshakable calmness that left him feeling small and powerless. As he looked around, the realization began to set in. The crowd was no longer on his side. The people who had been watching from a distance were now quietly observing, some even shaking their heads in disbelief at his behavior. The more the man looked around, the more he realized that he was the one who had been in the wrong. His attempts to provoke the guard had only made him look foolish in front of the onlookers. It was then that the man's confidence truly crumbled. The power he had once felt, the sense of superiority that had driven him to act the way he had, was now gone. In its place was a feeling of shame, a realization that he had failed, not only in provoking the guard, but in truly understanding what strength meant. The guard's quiet dignity had completely diffused the situation, leaving the man with no words, no actions, and no way to reclaim his earlier bravado. In that moment, the royal guard had shown him something far more powerful than anger or violence. He had shown him that true strength comes not from domination, but from control, the ability to remain calm, even in the face of provocation, and to rise above petty conflict with dignity and poise. The man stood there, his head hanging low, unable to meet the guard's unwavering gaze. As the tension in the air slowly began to fade, the crowd of onlookers stood frozen in place, still processing the unexpected turn of events. What had started as a confrontation filled with potential violence had been diffused without a single blow being struck. The royal guard stood tall, his face composed, his posture unchanging, while the man who had instigated the situation now stood speechless, his earlier bravado gone. The dog, once a symbol of aggression, now sat quietly at the guard's side, its once threatening demeanor now replaced with an almost confused calmness. The crowd, unsure of what to make of the situation, began to stir. Whispers began to spread among the onlookers, some of them exchanging glances with one another, clearly impressed by what they had just witnessed. Others, still unsure of how to respond, looked to the royal guard for guidance. It was as if everyone in that small crowd had been caught in the midst of a lesson that they weren't expecting to learn. The silence lingered for a moment longer, with all eyes on the guard. A few people, braver than the rest, stepped forward, breaking the quiet with soft murmurs of admiration. "Did you see that? He didn't even flinch," one person whispered to their companion. "Incredible," another murmured, clearly impressed by the guard's calmness and control. The words were quiet, but they were spoken with a sense of respect, as if the crowd had just witnessed something important, something that transcended the initial confrontation. The man who had started the trouble, meanwhile, seemed to shrink under the weight of the crowd's reaction. He looked around, his eyes darting between the people who were now beginning to judge him. The same people who had once been watching with curiosity were now looking at him with disdain. Their initial nervousness had been replaced with a sense of clarity. The guard had shown them what true strength was, and in doing so, he had left the man standing in a place of shame. The royal guard's calmness, his unflinching control, had turned the tables completely. Where there had once been a sense of power in the man's insults and threats, there was now only emptiness. The crowd was no longer on his side, and in the quiet moments that followed, many began to realize that they had witnessed something more significant than a confrontation between two individuals. They had seen the power of restraint, the kind of quiet authority that commanded respect without the need for aggression. Some of the onlookers even approached the guard, offering him words of praise. One older woman, her voice soft but clear, spoke to him with genuine gratitude. "That was incredible," she said. "You handled that situation with such grace." Her words were simple, but they carried a sense of admiration that was echoed by others in the crowd. The royal guard simply nodded, acknowledging their appreciation with a small but respectful gesture. He didn't seek attention or praise. His job wasn't about recognition. But in this moment, it was clear that his actions had left an impression on the people around him. He had done what many might have found impossible. He had faced provocation with an unshakable calm, and had shown that true power doesn't lie in force, but in the ability to remain composed and in control, even when faced with hostility. As the crowd continued to murmur amongst themselves, the atmosphere shifted once again. The earlier sense of unease had given way to something else, something quieter but far more powerful: respect. The royal guard had not only diffused a potentially violent situation, he had taught everyone around him a lesson in strength, resilience, and dignity. And for many of the people who had witnessed it, that lesson would stay with them long after the crowd had dispersed. The guard's influence had quietly but firmly shifted the mood, leaving behind a sense of awe and appreciation for the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, many still carried the weight of the scene they had just witnessed. Their conversations were quieter now, filled with admiration and reflection. Some of them hadn't expected the royal guard to handle the situation so calmly, so gracefully. It had been a moment of tension that could have easily escalated into chaos, yet the guard had done something extraordinary. He had remained silent, never once allowing anger or frustration to cloud his judgment. The royal guard, however, stood alone for a moment, deep in thought. His duty was far from over, and the events of the afternoon weren't something he could easily forget. As the last of the tourists wandered away, he took a slow breath, allowing the moment to sink in. There had been a time when he, too, would have reacted in anger or frustration. But over the years, through countless hours of training, he had come to understand something more profound. True strength didn't come from defeating others or proving dominance. It came from mastering one's own emotions and actions. The confrontation with the man and his dog had tested him, just as many situations had throughout his career. But what made this moment different was how the guard had chosen to handle it. He hadn't simply subdued the threat. He had diffused it with his calm and unwavering composure. It was something that could not be taught in a classroom or through physical training. It came from within, from the understanding that the greatest power lay in how one responded to adversity. As the royal guard reflected on the encounter, he thought about the man who had started the trouble. The anger, the insults, the sense of superiority. It had all come from a place of insecurity, a need to prove something. The guard had seen it before, people who tried to assert power over others because they didn't feel strong themselves. But the guard's response, rather than escalating the conflict, had shown the man something far more powerful, the power of restraint and dignity. The guard had done what he had been trained to do, but he had also done something more. He had shown the crowd that real strength wasn't about reacting with force, but about choosing how to respond in a way that showed respect for everyone involved, including the person who was trying to provoke him. He had shown that even in the face of hate or aggression, one could choose not to contribute to the cycle of negativity. He wondered if the man had learned anything from the encounter. The man had been so sure that his words and actions would get a rise out of the guard, but in the end, it was his own behavior that had caused him to lose the crowd's favor. The guard had not needed to shout back or physically defend himself. His calmness had won the day. The lesson in that was clear. Violence and anger only breed more of the same. But calmness, strength of character, and the choice to remain peaceful, those were the qualities that could change the tide of any situation. As he stood in the fading light of the day, the royal guard allowed himself a small, quiet moment of satisfaction. He hadn't just completed his duty in that moment. He had shown something more. He had been a reminder to everyone around him that true strength is not about domination or force, but about grace under pressure, the ability to remain true to one's values in the face of adversity. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. As the last few people trickled away from the scene, the royal guard remained standing, still composed and alert. The energy around him had shifted, and the street was quieter now, the usual hum of activity replaced with a sense of calm. The man who had started the whole ordeal had walked off, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his earlier anger now turned into a confused silence. It was as if the entire encounter had taken something from him, his sense of control, his attempt at dominance, his belief that he could provoke a reaction from anyone. And with it, he left a trail of quiet reflection in his wake. The crowd, however, was not as quick to forget what they had seen. The conversation continued, though now it was laced with a sense of respect for the guard. Some people who had been standing in the back of the crowd began to approach him, their eyes filled with admiration for the way he had handled the situation. "You handled that perfectly," one woman said, her voice soft but full of respect. Another man nodded in agreement, adding, "I've never seen someone stay so calm under pressure." The guard, though appreciative of the words, gave no indication that he was looking for praise. He simply nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes scanning the area, ever watchful. It wasn't about the compliments. It was about the duty he had sworn to uphold. Yet despite his quiet demeanor, the recognition from the people around him seemed to fill him with a quiet sense of pride. Not because he had done something extraordinary, but because he had done what he was meant to do. Maintain peace, not with violence, but with strength of character. In the days that followed, the story of the Royal Guard's calm response spread. It became a quiet talking point among locals and tourists alike. What had started as a small incident had grown into something far bigger, as people shared the story of how a man had tried to provoke a royal guard, only to be met with calm dignity instead of anger. It wasn't long before news outlets picked up on the story, with headlines about the guard's restraint and the power of peace circulating on social media. But more than the news stories or the praise, the true impact of what had happened was seen in the way people began to act. Some who had witnessed the scene started to share the lesson they had learned that day, that in the face of aggression, there was a better way to respond than to retaliate. It wasn't about avoiding confrontation or being passive. It was about choosing how to engage with the world. The Royal Guard had shown that responding with calm and control could de-escalate even the most volatile situations. The man who had attempted to provoke him, meanwhile, found himself facing the consequences of his actions. People in his circle began to distance themselves, and the shame of what had happened weighed on him. No longer was he seen as the one in control. Instead, he became the person who had failed to understand the true meaning of power. His attempt to belittle the guard had backfired, and in the process, he had unwittingly revealed his own vulnerabilities. For the Royal Guard, however, there was no change in his daily routine. He returned to his duties just as he had before. But now, the weight of his actions had not only left a lasting impression on those who had seen him in action, but it had also taught him something important about the power of restraint. The strength to walk away, to remain calm when provoked, was something that went beyond his uniform. It was a strength of character, one that would stay with him long after the day had ended. As the sun set over the city, the Royal Guard stood tall once again, a reminder to all who saw him that true strength lies not in dominance, but in the quiet power of peace. And in the end, that was the most unbelievable thing of all.